You know, from my aunt's estate, I inherited a bunch of the quilts that she bought online. Well, she didn't buy quilts, she bought quilt tops. She kind of had a problem. And she always said she was going to quilt them someday. Well, guess who someday is? Nice to meet you. So anyway, as I'm going through them, well, I had a conversation with her and I said, you know, someone's probably selling them because might be a problem with them. And as I inherited them, I understood that that was true. A lot of them had lasagna. What is lasagna? Well, it's a wavy edge. So let's talk today on Sewing Tech Talk about how to avoid lasagna, because this is absolutely delicious on your dinner plate. Not so much on your quilt. I'm Cathy. This is Sewing Tech Talk. This is the director. We'll see you soon. So there's a couple ways that you can avoid lasagna. And let's talk about some of those. So I have a few of her quilts that I'm trying to get done. And this one happens to be, the one in front of me happens to be a vintage quilt. And it is hand pieced and it's pretty vintage. I'm not really going to go in and do anything to fix the lasagna that's on the edge. Quite frankly, this one is also kind of tweaky. So I'm going to talk about some of the things that you can do up here at the table to kind of fix that. And then of course we're going to go to the Stellaire and see what we can do on the machine to make sure that doesn't happen when you're piecing your quilt, and you can fix it if you need to. So I've kind of been blocking this vintage quilt, and I do that a lot on most of my quilts. Now I have a small table. This is the size table I have in my sewing room because this is what fits. And you can work on a small table even with a large quilt. And I'm blocking it. So if you heard about, you know about when you wash a sweater and then you need to have it back in the same shape because it stretches out because it's a knit, right? Well, you can do the same thing that you do to that sweater, which is blocking it. You can do that to a quilt. What I do is I lay my quilt out. Now you can do this with just the quilt top or when it's layered on top of the batting. Sometimes you may need to do both. This quilt happens to be constructed with triangles, and it was hand pieced. And the issue with triangles is that at least one of the sides is going to be on the bias. Now fabric has 3 grains. It has the lengthwise grain, which hardly stretches at all, the crosswise grain, which stretches a little bit, and then the bias, which is the diagonal that really stretches. And once you stretch it, sometimes you can't get it back. Maybe if you get it moist, then you can kind of ease it back into where it needs to be. So that's what I'm doing when I block. What I do is I get the quilt, in this case I'm layering it to try to use that straight backing to help me get it flat. And I put a little bit of moisture on the top of it. Then I take my biggest ruler or a series of small rulers, and then I have these little weights that I made, and these little weights are just squares. I made mine fancy. You don't have to make them fancy at all. What they do is they help me, especially with a large quilt on a table. You know how the quilt or fabric's going to want to scoot off of a small table? Well, I just use my weights and it holds the fabric on the table, so I'm not chasing it when I'm trying to do my work. They also work great for being a weight to hold the quilt down into shape. So what I do after I moisten it, I kind of put it back into shape. I can see through in the ruler, I can see if it's square or not. Now what's the big deal about having it square? What's the big deal about no lasagna? Well, what happens is that when you're trying to quilt it, you know, we're trying to quilt it, we're trying to do the best job we can. If we're free motion quilting, we're really concentrating, right? And it's really hard to fight if you have extra fabric on the front of the quilt. If the edges are wavy, well, that extra fabric has to go somewhere. And when you're quilting, that somewhere can kind of result in a tuck, or you're fighting it the whole time. So if you can get the quilt flat before you even start your machine quilting adventure, well, that really, really helps and ease the stress. So this is being blocked. You can block it just the top. You can block it as the quilt is, like I said, and I just do a section at a time. After I moisten it, I put the ruler on, I put the weights on. Usually takes just a couple hours. Then I take everything off and let it air dry in position, and then I can do my pins if I have to, if it's ready to go with that work. You can do it multiple times if you need to. So that's one thing that you can do to the quilt. Now, as you're quilting, sometimes I will reblock it. Let me show you this little quilt. This is one I have for hers. And I just quilted in the ditch along these little lines, right? Now, I want to show you the back. What happens as you're quilting is the active quilting, it's going to kind of shrink up the quilt. And you might get a little bit of ruffle in the edge. Now, that's not excess fabric in that case, as long as you've done your due duty before that. But what you can do is, if this is starting to get out of control, just go ahead and reblock it for a little bit before you continue on with those borders. So blocking is kind of a very helpful way to get everything flat and under control. Now, I have a handout for this in all my videos, and the handout, I go through 5 different steps that we're going to talk about in the video. So that's one of the steps. Now, let me talk about 2 while I have you up here at the table. Now, what happens is, when you are piecing your quilt, and you're putting the pieces together, and you're sewing them up, let me pull this out so that you can see this other treasure I received. So here's another treasure, right? Yeah, fun little quilt. And I'm actually going to put some embroideries in here. I think it's going to be really neat when I get it done. But I want you to notice this one block. Look at this block. See how it's going off like that? Wow, that's probably not the look I'm going for. Unless it is the look I'm going for, but in this case, it's not. So why is this block going off there? Now, if we straighten it out, what's going to happen? Well, this border, this edge, well, all of a sudden I have massive lasagna. Why did this happen? Well, generally when you're piecing and you're going through, and we're going to do this at the machine, when the layers, sometimes when you get to the end of that seam, you kind of want to flare out just a little bit, because the machine, the pressure on the foot, it's going to kind of push that fabric and want to fling it out from under the foot. And we're into control, but if we have the right tools, like I'm show you at the machine, then maybe that won't happen. Because this occurs when the seam, let's pull back the curtain here, when the seam is too small. Now, when the seam is too small, it's not consistent across, then it's going to add extra fabric on that edge, right? So it's not this seam, it's probably not that seam, but looky here. Way back in the quilt, we have a seam that's really not very big at all. And there might be a couple others. So if you consistently have that across the quilt, this is the kind of thing that you get. So when you're piecing, you want to make sure that you're using the right foot. You're paying attention that as you quilt off that, you piece off that piece, that you're keeping consistent. And you might want to back tack a little bit at that edge. So we're going to address that at the machine. Now, another thing I want to show you. So now, when you get done piecing, sometimes we're done piecing. We can see the light at the end of the tunnel, and we're just want to get her done, right? So sometimes you just want to add that border on there. You're just going to slap a piece of fabric on there and sew it. Let me show you what happens. Here's an example. So this is the one of quilts that she had. And when you lay it flat, now this is one solid piece with applique on it, right? There's no opportunity for the piecing to go wrong. But someone, and I don't know who it is, someone just took the fabric, laid it on the edge, and just sewed it down. And so what happens is there's extra fabric that gets pulled into that border. Can you see the lasagna on the edge? Now, if I was to try to do a straight stitch, can you see what's going to happen? I just can't do it. So I have the opportunity to take this border off. And I did. I'm going to take the rest of them off also. But check it out. Can you see on the side here? There's an extra, and this is a short quilt. This is not very big. Can you imagine what would happen on a full-size quilt? Do you see the extra fabric that got pulled in there? That's why there's lasagna or a ruffled edge, because the fabric has to go somewhere. So what we really need to do is, when we do our borders, we need to measure the quilt, or you can lay the border fabric on there. We need to measure the quilt and lay the piece out and cut it before we sew it on. Then you divide the piece into quarters, you divide the edge of the quilt into quarters, and you line everything up. That way you know when you're sewing it on there, everything has to fit. It's the same procedure you do when you do a neckline. You line it up so that you know you don't have more here and less here. It just makes perfect sense. So we're going to go to the machine and we're going to do that. Of course, I have to take the rest of it off. Now, if this was a big quilt, I would literally take my measuring tape and I would measure it. And I would measure this. Now, does this side the same as this side, the measurement? Maybe not. So you might have to measure the sides, a little bit differently. Or you can be the enforcer, repiece this, and make them both match. That's kind of fun. Anyway, enough of me talking, enough of looking at my ants, my quilts. Now, let's go to the machine. We're going to go to the Stellaire, and we'll talk about piecing that stays consistent, what you can do when you're putting the border on, and let's talk about some quilting designs that are going to work, because, sometimes you just can't fix it. So here we are at the Stellaire, and let's use all the equipment we have at our disposal to make sure we don't get, wavy. So now, some stuff comes with the Stellaire that's really super helpful in getting your piecing just right. And this may come with your machine, it may not. Some things you might be able to add to your machine. I've done videos in the past where I've used the single needle hole plate that does come with the Stellaire, and I find that super, super useful. When we're talking about the bobbin cover, that's the part that goes right here. The Stellaire comes with two, and I put the one on the machine that shows the 1/4 inch mark. This foot comes with the Stellaire. It's the 1/4 inch foot with guide, and I find that useful as well. I am sewing with the Ultra T foot, which is an anti-friction foot, so I find that works really, really well. Now, when I put on my border, I'm going to show you the digital dual feed that comes with the Stellaire. But there's an optional foot, which is the 1/4 inch sole. This is the foot, and then this is the sole that you can get for that. And sometimes I use my seam ripper as a stiletto, but you can get an official stiletto to really help you be the enforcer. And then sometimes I press my my fabric with Best Press 2 to give it a little bit extra body. I find sometimes that helps me control it when I get in there. So now, let's set up the machine. Let's see what we have. Let's move this out of the way so that we can sew. Now, if you notice down here, I do have the Ultra T foot on, and I've engaged the LED guide light, and I do have that visual of the 1/4 inch. On the screen, I have selected my center piecing stitch, which is in the quilt tab right here. And I have the LED guide light set at 9.5. Remember, my setting might be different than yours. Now, one thing that's kind of neat on this machine is what you see here is what you get. So if I bring up a ruler, you can see the distance between that stitch and the guide light is a little bit less than a 1/4 inch. And that really works for me with my vision issues. So now, let's get this little fun quilt repaired. Now remember, I'm not throwing any shade on this quilter. I don't even know who they are. And I looked over the whole edges all the way around. It's great all the way, except for this one seam that went off, it went off the rails just a little bit. And it can only take one seam to, make your machine quilting a little bit more miserable. So let's call this the midnight special. I can see everything else was good, but this one, maybe the roast was burning in the oven and then she had to leave, or he had to leave really fast. So let's bring it on up here. Now, do I have to take the seam apart? Well, maybe I do, maybe I don't. So over the presser foot. And you can see I have that guide light right along the edge. Now with most quilts, you do press the seam to one side. So if I do that, I don't necessarily have to take this off. I can if I want to, but say there's a bunch of them, maybe you don't want to do that. So because this seam's going to be pressed to one side, I'm just going to stitch a better 1/4 inch seam right here. Now you can see I have that LED guide light, I have the edge of the foot, I have the guide right here, and we're just going to sew steady off to the end just to make sure we have our 1/4 inch seam. I've engaged the pivot so the foot will lift up when I take the pressure off the foot pedal so I can adjust everything. And I'll take my pin out. Do a little back stitch, use the scissors, and you can hopefully see, wow, that was really off quite a bit. Now that may be only 1/8 of an inch, but 1/8 of an inch times 2, because there's 2 layers of fabric, that can add 1/4 inch to the edge of your quilt. And that extra 1/4 inch, well, that could be the wave that you don't want. And then especially if you just sew on that border, well, you can see, well, disaster might be coming. So now, let's sew on that border. And I have another thing I'd like to show you, which I sometimes do. Now, all this has to come off because I have a bigger quilt, and I'm going to hand this off to the cameraman, who's my able assistant. Thank you, cameraman.
You're welcome.
He's not really an ogre, really. So here's my border that I put on. I measured it. And here's the other thing that I sometimes do that might be helpful to you. I hope you can see that I'm not only stitching my border on, but I'm stitching it through the batting and the backing at the same time. It's kind of a flip and sew technique. So as I'm stitching it down through all the layers, I'm kind of quilting it too. And when I flip it out, I don't necessarily have to stitch that seam. And quilted it also. So that's one method. Remember I said sometimes when you quilt, it shrinks up the quilt on the inside. So if the density on the inside is going to be more than the density on the outside, then this might be an option. Quilt the inside, block it for sure, and then put your border on and stitch it through all the layers. Now, I talked about quilting designs too. When I have a border that's kind of wavy, kind of like this one, remember that straight stitch isn't going to work. Now, if I've blocked it and I still have a problem, what you can use is an open quilting to come off to the edge. So when I'm quilting, say instead of doing a straight line or lines that meet, you might want to do maybe like a stipple to kind of take and encase that, well, that wave on the inside, if there's no way for you to take it out. Because like I said, some things, they're just really hard to fix. So now, let's switch over to that digital dual feed, and I want to show you one more thing. So I'm going to take off the ankle. And now here we go. We're going to put it on. Now the digital feed, dual feed, has a band on the bottom that's in constant contact with that fabric, which really helps you control that fabric. And what you do is you take it and you plug it into the back of the machine. That's how the machine controls that band to make sure that it's going at the speed that you have requested. Now at the screen, the machine has switched over to show me I have that digital feed on. I'm going to take the sole off and pop the 1/4 inch sole on. And you can see how I have everything lined up now, just so. Now remember I said that when I plug it into the back, it controls the speed of the digital dual feed, which is great, right? Now, the thing is that it doesn't necessarily have to pull the top at the same rate that it pulls the bottom. I have control of that in the settings of the Stellaire. So if I come into the settings of the Stellaire, I can choose the adjustment for the digital dual feed. Now if I need to feed a little bit more on the top, I can do a plus here all the way up to +10, and that will pull the top fabric in just a little bit. Maybe that's what I need. If I hit the minus, I can use it to kind of spread it out just a little bit, and maybe that's what I need. So I'm going to go with just a 1. Now, what numbers do you choose? Well, that just depends on your fabric and your project, and maybe even the time of the day. So do a sample, see what works, and you can always make adjustments on the fly. Or do a sample, and then you know what you're doing when you get up there. So let's sew this border on, and let's hope I don't have any waves on the edge. Everything came out even. And everything came out flat. So I think quilting this little quilt is going to be a joy. One thing I do is I press it on out, and you could even put a little bit of maybe a fusible in there to hold it down. Now remember, when you put on the other parts of the border, you're going to remeasure. Now, with the other border on, we're going to remeasure across there. Put our pins in, you know the process. I'm Kathy. This has been Sewing Tech Talk. Go get your hand out. I'm going to shoot it off to George, and he's going to tell you a lot more about the Stellaire, which is a pretty powerful machine with lots of, well, fun things to make sure that the only time you're surfing the waves, well, is at the beach.
Thanks, Kathy. That was an incredible presentation. And so let's go over the special offer we have on the Brother Stellaire series. So we have the XJ2, which is their combination sewing and embroidery, and the XE2, which is dedicated embroidery. They both share the same embroidery features, which is a large 9.5 by 14 inch embroidery area with over 780 built-in embroidery designs, and of them, over 100 of them are Disney. It also has over 30 fonts and large beautiful monograms, and with the fonts you can edit in all kinds of arrangements. You can arc, you can array, you can even cut and paste and kern it in some custom ways. Speaking of customization, you can take a design and do an automatic applique around it, and with the matrix copy you can copy this very quickly to make patches. And if we had the scan and cut, we can actually send it to the scan and cut out those patches, and then embroider them beautifully. An additional advanced technology is a new 2-point laser positioning. I can take something like a name and position it perfectly on a line. I can use it to do multiple hoopings and match them perfectly. I can even use it for edge-to-edge quilting. Now, part of what the Stellaire series offers is a special relationship with the scan and cut. They actually can marry together, so I can send an applique design right from my machine and it will cut it out perfectly for beautiful applique. But better yet, I can send a design from my scan and cut and turn it into embroidery. It also unlocks a new feature where I can choose one of the colors of my design, whether if it's a built-in design, I can choose that and turn it into applique. But let's take that heart that I sent over. I turn it into embroidery. I select the color, and now it's applique. Now let's bring over the third part of the piece. I want to create my own fabric, and I can do that with Print Moda. I took an image of a rose and I arranged it just in a beautiful kaleidoscope of color, and I printed that fabric and placed it on in the scan and cut. I took my design I created on the Stellaire from the scan and cut, sent it over to the scan and cut it out, and I have one complete embroidery design created with that trifecta of creativity. Now the XJ2 also is a sewing machine, and it has a large 11.25 inch opening, beautiful lighting. It has 760 built-in stitches, from quilting stitches to applique to utility. It even has automatic stippling and some beautiful decorative stitches that are very, very wide. It also has an automatic 1/4 inch feature which moves the needle over a 1/4 inch from the foot, and you can use the laser guidance it has on there so you can just do some beautiful piecing. It also has amazing fabric control with an automatic fabric sensor, and this gives you the ability to sense multiple layers like in denim, or if I want to sew on some sheer fabric like this tricot, I can do that beautifully, or even working with elastics. It handles the fabric beautifully. If it's even more extreme, we can add the digital dual feed. This is a belt-driven feed system that gives perfect contact on the fabric. And so you see here with this marine vinyl, there's no slippage. I also can use it with such things as minky, which is hard to sew with, and of course, quilting. For more information on this incredible product, click on the link to see our current special offer. You can email us at customerservice@moores-sew.com or call us at 1-800-865-9664.